A black woman, poised and ready for a long-anticipated vacation, steps onto a private jet, ticket in hand. Every detail confirmed, but within moments, everything shifts. A flight attendant questions her presence, and the captain, without hesitation, orders her off the plane. Humiliated and standing alone on the tarmac, she makes one phone call. 7 minutes later, the entire crew is dismissed, and the jet's door reopens, this time with apologies. What happened next sent shockwaves through the airline, sparking changes that rippled far beyond that runway. Stay with me, this is a story of justice you won't want to miss. Before we get into it, let me know where you're tuning in from, and if stories like this inspire you. Don't forget to hit subscribe for more incredible tales of resilience and power. The late afternoon sun hung low over the private airfield, casting long shadows across the tarmac. The hum of jet engines and idle chatter of ground crew filled the air, underscoring the quiet luxury of the place. This was not an airport of hurried travelers and crowded terminals. This was a sanctuary for the few, the powerful, and the wealthy. Margaret Daniels stepped out of the sleek black SUV, the door held open by a uniformed driver. Her heels touched the ground with the same quiet assurance that had carried her through boardrooms and negotiations. But here on this strip of asphalt reserved for those who moved the world from behind tinted windows, her presence felt like an unexpected ripple in otherwise still waters. Margaret was accustomed to these spaces, but she never felt at ease in them. The air was too thick with unspoken rules, the kind no one dared write down but everyone understood. Rules about who belonged and who didn't. Her eyes, sharp and discerning, scanned the terminal, noting the polished glass facade reflecting the fading sun. Men in tailored suits, women in designer sunglasses, figures that drifted like ghosts from luxury cars to waiting jets. They moved with the ease of entitlement, a rhythm Margaret recognized but never internalized. She adjusted the strap of her handbag and walked forward, her steps deliberate. The driver nodded and returned to the SUV, but Margaret hardly noticed. She was already thinking 2 moves ahead. Inside, the terminal was quiet but bustling in the way exclusive spaces often were. Staff flitted about, their smiles perfunctory, their voices hushed. At the far end of the lobby stood the reception counter, white marble, backlit, and cold to the touch. Behind it, a young woman typed without looking up. Margaret approached with the calm grace she always carried. But even before she reached the counter, she felt that flicker of hesitation that was impossible to miss. A glance, brief but weighty, the kind of look that had followed her since childhood. The one that questioned before any words were spoken. "Good afternoon," Margaret said, her voice smooth, as she placed her ticket confirmation on the counter. "I'm here for Flight 809, Gulfstream to Chicago." The receptionist's hands paused mid-keystroke. She looked up, her brows twitching slightly in surprise. "Flight 809, she repeated, as though Margaret had misspoken. "Yes," Margaret replied, folding her hands neatly. The woman nodded, but Margaret caught the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. A beat too long passed before the receptionist responded. "I'll have to check on that for you," she said, disappearing through a door behind the counter. Margaret remained still. She had learned, long ago, not to let moments like these rush her. The room seemed quieter now. Or perhaps she had simply tuned it out. Her eyes drifted across the lobby, taking in the familiar architecture of wealth. Art that whispered its value rather than shouted. Floors polished to a mirrored sheen. Everything designed to impress, to establish hierarchy without words. It was in places like this that Margaret always felt the weight of 2 lives, the one she lived and the one people assumed she lived. The door opened again, and when the receptionist returned, she was not alone. A man in a crisp uniform followed closely behind her, his steps heavy with authority. Captain John Brooks, tall, silver-haired, and exuding that particular brand of arrogance that came not from competence but from knowing his place in the world had never been questioned. "Ma'am," Brooks said, his eyes narrowing as he approached. "I'm Captain Brooks. Is there something I can help you with?" Margaret suppressed the sigh rising in her throat. She could already hear the shape of this conversation, even if the words hadn't yet formed. "I believe there's been some confusion," she said, holding out her phone with the confirmation. "I'm booked on Flight 809. Brooks didn't even glance at the screen. His arms folded across his chest, and his lips pulled into a polite, condescending smile. "I'm afraid that's a private charter." "Ma'am," This terminal isn't open to the public. Margaret's gaze sharpened, but her tone remained steady. I understand that. This isn't my first time flying out of this terminal. Brooks's smile didn't fade, but something colder settled behind his eyes. We've had issues before, he said, his voice dropping slightly, as though he were letting her in on a secret. People trying to board flights they aren't cleared for. I'm sure you understand security protocols and all that. Margaret held his gaze without blinking. There it was, the unspoken rule surfacing. I see, she said quietly. And did you confirm with the booking office? I'll need you to wait while we do that, Brooks replied, signaling subtly toward the door. It might take a while. So you're welcome to make yourself comfortable in the main lounge. The implication hung between them like smoke. Margaret could have explained. She could have mentioned her investments in the company, her partnerships, the seat she held on the board. But she didn't. Not yet. She wasn't interested in forcing recognition to bypass the assumptions Brooks had already made. Instead, she slipped her phone back into her handbag and smiled faintly. Of course, she said, stepping aside with the same quiet grace she had walked in with. But as she moved away, her hand found the phone again. David, she said calmly when the line clicked. I need you to meet me at the terminal. Now. She ended the call and settled into a seat by the window, watching as the horizon stretched wide and unbroken ahead of her. Margaret Daniels had played this game before. But today, she had no intention of letting it end the same way. Margaret sat near the large glass windows overlooking the tarmac. The late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the ground, its warmth glazing the private jets lined like silver ornaments waiting for their masters. Outside, the world seemed calm, but Margaret felt a shift in the air, the kind of shift that didn't come with noise but with silence. She crossed her legs, the leather of the chair cool against her skin, and let her gaze drift over the space. The terminal was quiet but not empty. A few men, dressed in suits as polished as the marble floors, lingered by the coffee station, speaking in low tones that occasionally broke into quiet laughter. An older couple, white, refined, with the air of wealth passed down rather than earned, sat a few rows away. Flipping through magazines, the woman's gaze flicked toward Margaret, lingered a second too long, then turned away with a glance to her husband. Margaret recognized this choreography well, the small ballet of exclusion performed daily in places like this. A soft chime from her phone pulled her attention. David Harrison had responded. On my way. Give me 15. Margaret allowed herself a faint smile. David always arrived when she needed him to, even if she rarely called. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a shared recognition of how the world could shrink or expand depending on who held the keys. But 15 minutes was a long time in a space that didn't belong to you. Across the room, Captain Brooks had not returned to his post. He lingered near the security desk, speaking to a young officer who listened with a posture too stiff to be casual. Brooks's eyes flicked toward her occasionally, each glance a question he wasn't bold enough to ask aloud. Margaret wondered how long it would take for him to escalate this. Moments like these never started with raised voices or outright refusals. They started with polite suggestions to wait over here, with the double-checking of documents that needed no verification, and with eyes that said, "You do not belong," even when no words followed. Margaret leaned back, crossing her arms loosely. She would wait. She was good at waiting. The door to the terminal opened with a soft whoosh, and a new passenger stepped inside. A white man mid-40s, salt and pepper hair, wearing a navy blazer and an expensive watch that gleamed as he adjusted his sleeve. His walk was relaxed, the kind of gait that spoke to years of unchallenged movement through spaces like this. Margaret recognized him immediately. Gregory Hill, CEO of a mid-sized tech firm. Someone she had crossed paths with at a conference the year before. Gregory's eyes swept over the room and landed on Brooks, who immediately stepped forward with a broad smile and an outstretched hand. They exchanged pleasantries, easy, warm, familiar. There was no confirmation of identity, no request to see flight details. Gregory Hill was the kind of man whose presence required no justification. Margaret watched the interaction with a calm, detached interest. This, too, was part of the dance. Gregory's gaze eventually slid over to her. His smile faltered for a half-second, and recognition flickered in his eyes. He hesitated, then walked toward her with the confidence of someone who assumed a shared understanding. Margaret Daniels, he said, offering his hand. I didn't expect to see you here. She shook his hand, her grip firm but brief. Gregory, it's been a while. Flying out somewhere this evening? He asked. His voice light but curious. Chicago, she replied evenly. Gregory's smile tightened just a fraction. Ah, I see. It was always there. That split-second calculation. Gregory was polite, but Margaret could feel the gears turning behind his eyes. There was a question he wanted to ask but wouldn't. Not directly. Why was she flying out of this terminal? Who did she know? But Margaret said nothing more. She wasn't interested in making his discomfort easier. As Gregory turned back toward Brooks, Margaret's eyes followed. She could see it plainly now, Brooks's lingering confusion. The unspoken exchange that passed between the two men. Gregory didn't have to say anything outright. His glance alone confirmed what Brooks had already suspected. And just like that, the room felt heavier. 10 minutes passed. Margaret heard Brooks before she saw him. His steps carried more weight now. The soft thud of a decision made. He approached with a smile that never touched his eyes. Miss Daniels, he began, using her name now as though it was an afterthought. I apologize for the delay. Unfortunately, I've been informed that there may have been an error with your booking. We're still waiting for final confirmation. Margaret lifted her gaze to meet his. Unblinking, my confirmation was already provided. What else is there to verify? Brooks hesitated for a fraction of a second, just long enough for Margaret to see the crack in his performance. It's just protocol, he said finally. Protocol, a word used to make prejudice sound reasonable. Margaret held his gaze a moment longer, then smiled faintly. Of course. She could feel the eyes in the room shifting toward them. The older couple nearby was listening now, their magazines forgotten in their laps. Margaret wasn't unfamiliar with this theater. She knew that if she raised her voice, the room would not hear a woman defending her right to board a plane. They would hear a disturbance, a disruption to the carefully maintained calm of their privileged space. And so Margaret Daniels sat quietly, her silence louder than anything she could say aloud. Outside the terminal, a sleek black car pulled into the parking area, and David Harrison stepped out. Brooks saw him immediately, and Margaret watched with quiet satisfaction as the confidence drained from his face. The siege was ending, but Margaret knew it was only the first skirmish. The soft click of David Harrison's shoes echoed against the marble floor as he entered the terminal. His presence shifted the energy in the room, like a draft moving through a house that had been sealed too long. David was not a man who commanded attention with his voice but with the way space bent around him. Tall, sharp-featured, and black like Margaret, his tailored suit carried the weight of unspoken authority. Captain Brooks straightened immediately, his stance shifting to something that could almost pass for respect. Margaret watched from her seat by the window, the faintest trace of a smile touching the corner of her lips. There was a certain satisfaction in seeing how quickly the air thinned around men like Brooks when the right person walked into the room. David's eyes found her across the terminal, and he nodded, but he did not approach her right away. His first stop, as Margaret knew it would be, was Brooks. Captain Brooks, David greeted, extending his hand. Brooks hesitated, then shook it, his grip a fraction weaker than it had been with Gregory Hill. Mr. Harrison, Brooks replied, forcing a smile. Good to see you. David's gaze didn't waver. I understand there's been some confusion regarding Miss Daniels' flight. Brooks shifted, his weight moving from one foot to the other. The carefully curated confidence he had worn earlier was fraying at the edges. Just a misunderstanding, I'm sure. I was explaining to Miss Daniels that we needed to verify her booking. These things happen, protocol. You know. David's face did not change, but Margaret saw the way his eyes cooled. I'm quite familiar with protocol, Captain, but I don't recall anything in our guidelines that allows personal judgment to override documented confirmations. Brooks's mouth opened, but David continued before he could speak. Miss Daniels is not only a guest on this flight, David said, his voice measured, but a shareholder in this company. Any delay she experiences is a reflection of our collective failure. I assume you understand the implications of that. The silence that followed was thick, like the pause before thunder. Margaret rose slowly, letting her heels tap deliberately against the floor as she crossed the terminal to stand beside David. She didn't need him to speak for her, but there was a certain poetry in watching how quickly the stage shifted when the right curtain was pulled back. Brooks swallowed, his gaze flickering between them. Of course. I apologize for the inconvenience. Miss Daniels, we'll have you boarded immediately. David nodded but said nothing more. Margaret met Brooks's eyes directly for the first time since he had questioned her presence. She didn't need to say much. Silence carried more weight when wielded correctly. Brooks stepped aside, vanishing toward the tarmac. The older couple who had been watching the exchange looked away hurriedly, burying themselves in the glossy pages of their magazines as if the incident had not happened within earshot. David turned to Margaret, his voice lowering. I see you're still causing trouble. She smirked. They make it too easy. The Gulfstream jet gleamed under the setting sun, its polished surface catching every fragment of light. Margaret ascended the steps with David close behind. But the moment she crossed the threshold of the cabin, she could feel the weight again. It wasn't Brooks anymore. It was the crew, young, white, and nervous. Their smiles were brittle, stretched too thin to feel genuine. Margaret could read the questions hanging in their eyes. Who is she? The lead flight attendant, a woman no older than 30, stepped forward, hands clasped in front of her stomach. Welcome aboard, Miss Daniels, she said, her voice steady but practiced. Please let me know if there's anything I can do to make your flight more comfortable. Margaret's eyes lingered on the young woman's face. She didn't doubt the attendant's professionalism, but there was something else, a tightness around the mouth. The small betrayals of body language. Margaret had seen it before. Thank you, Margaret replied smoothly. I'll let you know. She took her seat by the window, setting her handbag neatly beside her. David sank into the seat across the aisle, his attention already shifting to his phone. The door to the jet closed with a soft thud, sealing them off from the terminal. But Margaret knew the walls they faced were not so easily shut out. As the engines hummed to life, the flight attendant reappeared, offering her a glass of sparkling water. Margaret accepted it, her fingers grazing the rim of the glass as she watched the tarmac roll past the window. David glanced up from his phone. You're quiet. Margaret tilted her head slightly. I'm thinking. About Brooks? She shook her head. Brooks is nothing new. Men like him are part of the architecture. They reinforce the walls, but they didn't build them. David set his phone down, studying her carefully. You think there are more? Margaret's gaze drifted toward the galley, where the young flight attendant lingered, speaking in hushed tones to another crew member. Their eyes flickered toward her once, then darted away. Yes, Margaret said quietly. I think this goes deeper than Brooks. David leaned back in his seat, exhaling softly. So, what's the plan? Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. We stopped being polite about it. The hum of the jet deepened as it lifted off the ground, slicing through the air with the ease of those who had never been told no. But Margaret Daniels knew something they didn't. She knew that the sky, no matter how vast, did not belong to them alone. The Gulfstream sliced through the sky, high above the patchwork of city lights unraveling beneath it. Margaret Daniels sat by the window, her reflection faint against the glass, watching as the world below drifted further from reach. Inside the cabin, the hum of the engines filled the silence like a steady undercurrent, a rhythm Margaret had learned to live with, persistent, inescapable. David sat across from her, scrolling through emails, the glow of his phone casting sharp lines across his face. The tension that had followed them from the terminal lingered in the air like smoke that had yet to fully clear. Margaret took a slow sip of water, letting the cold settle in her chest. She could feel the quiet weight of the crew behind her, moving through their tasks with the kind of stiffness that only appeared when people weren't sure how to navigate someone else's existence. The lead flight attendant appeared again, her steps almost inaudible against the plush carpet. She leaned in carefully, as if proximity alone might spark some unspoken trouble. Miss Daniels, she said softly, we'll be serving dinner shortly. Is there anything specific you'd like? Margaret studied her for a moment, her crisp uniform, the way her hands folded tightly in front of her apron. Her smile was there, but it did not quite touch her eyes. No, thank you, Margaret replied, her voice even. The flight attendant nodded quickly, as if relieved by the simplicity of the answer, and disappeared back into the galley. David raised an eyebrow. I think you scared her. I didn't say anything, Margaret said, setting her glass down with a soft clink. You didn't have to. Margaret turned to him, her eyes narrowing slightly. Do you think that's on me? David met her gaze without hesitation. No, he said, But you know how it works. They don't see you. They see what they expect to see. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. That's the problem, isn't it? David didn't answer immediately. He leaned back in his seat, folding his arms across his chest. It's not new. No, Margaret said softly, glancing back toward the window. It isn't. The world outside was still stretching away beneath them, miles of streets. Homes, people, all shrinking into dots of distant light. But even at 40,000 feet, Margaret felt the weight of what was left behind. Dinner came and went, the scent of roasted chicken and butter lingering faintly in the cabin. David had fallen asleep, one hand resting on the armrest, the other still loosely gripping his phone. Margaret remained awake, her eyes skimming the headlines on her tablet, though none of the words seemed to stick. She wasn't reading, she was listening. She could hear the flight attendants murmuring quietly in the galley, their voices just below the threshold of comprehension. The sound wasn't unusual, but something about the cadence felt different, faster, sharper. Margaret let the tablet rest in her lap, her head tilting slightly toward the aisle. One of the attendants emerged, Rachel, the youngest of the crew. Her footsteps slowed as she neared Margaret's row, hesitating for just a fraction too long before continuing down the aisle. Margaret's eyes followed her. Is something wrong? Margaret asked, her voice cutting through the soft hum of the cabin. Rachel stopped, startled. Oh, no, ma'am, not at all. Margaret didn't look away. You're sure? Rachel's eyes flickered toward the galley before returning to Margaret. Her lips parted slightly as if to respond. But then she closed them again. Yes, Rachel said quickly. Everything's fine. But Margaret recognized the look, hesitation wrapped in fear. The kind of fear that didn't belong to the air or the altitude. It was something else, something deeper. Margaret let her eyes linger for a moment longer, then gave a faint nod. Thank you, she said quietly. Rachel hurried back toward the front of the plane, disappearing behind the curtain that separated the galley from the cabin. Margaret's gaze shifted toward David, who was still sleeping soundly. But the stillness in the air was growing thicker, and Margaret could feel it pressing in around her. An hour passed. The cabin lights dimmed as the flight slipped deeper into the night. Margaret closed her tablet and leaned back against the seat, her eyes drifting shut. But sleep didn't come easily. Somewhere near the galley, she heard the low murmur again, two voices. One sharper now. Captain Brooks. His tone carried just enough weight to rise above the other. Margaret opened her eyes slowly. The curtain to the galley was pulled back slightly, and through the narrow slit, she could see Brooks speaking to the lead flight attendant. His arms were crossed, his head tilted as he listened to whatever concern she was voicing. Margaret couldn't hear every word, but she caught enough. I'm telling you, it's unusual, the attendant whispered. Brooks shook his head, his expression unreadable. It's not your job to question passengers. Just keep things quiet. We don't need attention drawn to this. Margaret sat up a little straighter. She knew what this was. She had seen it before. In hotels, in restaurants, in boardrooms cloaked with glass and steel. The unease didn't come from her actions but from the absence of any wrongdoing they could point to. She had followed the rules, and somehow that was worse. Margaret's eyes met Brooks's for just a second through the curtain before he stepped back, disappearing toward the cockpit. It wasn't over. But Margaret Daniels had long since learned how to sit with the weight of being seen and unseen all at once. The hum of the jet engines filled the cabin with a quiet persistence. But Margaret Daniels could feel the weight of something else, the unspoken and the unresolved, pressing in from every corner like air that had thinned just enough to be noticed. David was still asleep, his head resting slightly to the side. But Margaret sat upright, her eyes fixed on the curtain separating the galley from the cabin. She was not waiting for anything specific, but she knew something would come. It always did. The plane dipped slightly as it cut through a pocket of turbulence. But Margaret's focus never wavered. Outside the window, the sky stretched on, an endless expanse that seemed indifferent to whatever storm was brewing inside. The curtain rustled. Rachel emerged again, but this time her steps were more hesitant, her gaze flickering toward Margaret before quickly dropping to the floor. Margaret saw it clearly now, the small crack in the performance. The shift in demeanor that came when someone wasn't sure which side of the room they belonged to. Margaret leaned forward slightly, her voice low but steady. Rachel, she called softly. The young attendant stopped mid-step, her head snapping up. Yes, ma'am? Margaret gestured to the seat across from her. Sit down for a minute. Rachel hesitated, glancing quickly toward the galley. But something in Margaret's gaze held her there. After a moment, she lowered herself carefully into the seat, hands clasped tightly in her lap. Margaret let the silence linger between them, giving Rachel space to fill it or not. You've been watching me, Margaret said finally. Why? Rachel's eyes widened briefly before she looked away, as if the question itself was something she hadn't prepared for. I wasn't watching you, ma'am, just doing my job. Margaret smiled faintly, but there was no humor in it. Rachel, I've spent my entire life being watched. I know the difference between curiosity and caution. Rachel swallowed, her fingers twisting slightly in her lap. I'm not upset, Margaret added. I just want to know what you're afraid of. Rachel shifted, and for a moment it seemed as if she might retreat back behind her professional mask. But something shifted, some crack in the thin wall between fear and trust, and her shoulders slumped slightly. It's not you, ma'am, Rachel said quietly. It's Captain Brooks. Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly. Go on. Rachel glanced toward the galley again, as if checking for unseen ears. He's been asking about you, Rachel admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Not directly, just small things. If I'd noticed anything unusual. Margaret's jaw tightened, though she kept her expression calm. And did you? Rachel shook her head quickly. No, ma'am, of course not, but he doesn't like things he can't explain. I think you make him nervous. Margaret let the weight of Rachel's words settle over her, each one fitting into place like stones carefully laid along a path she already knew too well. Men like him always find ways to explain things, Margaret said softly, her eyes drifting to the window. It's just a matter of what story they decide to tell. Rachel looked at her, uncertain. What do you mean? Margaret turned her gaze back to Rachel, her eyes sharp but not unkind. They can't accept that someone like me is here because I belong, she said, so they invent reasons, a mistake, a misunderstanding, something they can frame in policies and protocol, so it doesn't look like what it is. Rachel's shoulders tensed, but she nodded faintly. I've seen it happen before. Margaret folded her hands neatly in her lap. And what happens next? Rachel hesitated, her voice dropping even lower. Usually, nothing. People let it slide. Nobody wants to question him. Margaret's gaze softened, but the steel in her voice remained. Then maybe it's time someone did. Rachel's eyes flickered with something Margaret recognized, a mixture of fear and quiet hope. The kind of hope that often faded too quickly in the face of reality. Before Rachel could respond, the cockpit door opened with a quiet hiss, and Captain Brooks stepped into the cabin. His eyes swept over the scene, narrowing slightly as they landed on Rachel seated across from Margaret. Rachel stood immediately, straightening her posture as if summoned by some silent cue. Miss Daniels, Brooks greeted, his voice polite but distant. Everything all right here? Margaret met his gaze calmly, tilting her head slightly. Perfectly fine, Captain. Rachel was just keeping me company. Brooks's smile was thin, barely there. I see. Well, I wouldn't want to distract my crew too long. We have a smooth flight ahead. Margaret watched him for a moment, reading the subtle tension in his stance, the way his eyes lingered a second too long, as if he were searching for something that wasn't there. Rachel quickly retreated to the galley, and Brooks lingered for just a breath longer before offering a stiff nod and returning to the cockpit. Margaret exhaled slowly, leaning back into her seat as the hum of the engines once again filled the silence. David stirred slightly across the aisle, blinking as he sat up. Something wrong? He asked groggily, rubbing his eyes. Margaret smiled faintly, shaking her head. No, nothing new. David stretched, casting a glance toward the galley. Brooks still circling? Margaret's eyes drifted back to the window, the city lights below now distant specks on the horizon. He's circling, she said quietly, but I'm not the one who's going to flinch first. The sky outside was black now, cut only by the faint scatter of stars and the thin line of the moon. The jet felt smaller under the weight of night. The cabin lights dimmed to a soft glow that seemed to shrink the space between its passengers. But Margaret Daniels knew darkness did not erase tension, it only made it quieter. David was awake now, his phone forgotten on the armrest. Across from him, Margaret's posture had not shifted. She held herself in that careful way she always did, as if the very act of relaxing might allow something to slip through the cracks. They hadn't spoken much since Captain Brooks's brief appearance. But there was no need. David could read the room as well as she could. "You know he's watching," David said quietly. Margaret smiled faintly, eyes still fixed on the window. "He doesn't know how to stop." David leaned back, folding his arms. "You'd think he'd be smarter than that." Margaret's reflection in the glass shifted slightly as she turned toward him. "Men like him don't need to be smart. The system does the work for them." David exhaled softly. "And the system's still alive and well." "I see." Margaret's gaze drifted past him, toward the curtain at the front of the cabin. The galley was silent now, but she could feel Brooks's presence lingering just out of sight. "Alive," she said, "and comfortable." David's eyes narrowed slightly. "Until you make it uncomfortable." Margaret smiled again, but this time there was something sharper beneath it. "Exactly." A soft knock against the cabin partition broke the silence. Rachel stepped forward, holding a silver tray with coffee and a small plate of biscuits. Her hands were steady, but Margaret could see the tension in the way she held her shoulders. "I thought you might like something warm." "Miss Daniels," Rachel said softly, setting the tray down with care. Margaret glanced at the untouched glass of water still resting by her side but offered a nod of appreciation. "Thank you, Rachel." Rachel lingered for a moment longer, as if searching for something to say, but then retreated quickly back to the galley. David watched her disappear. "She's nervous." Margaret picked up the cup, letting the warmth settle into her palm. "She's young, and she understands what's happening better than she lets on." David frowned slightly. "You think Brooks will come back?" Margaret sipped her coffee, letting the bitterness linger on her tongue. "I think Brooks never left." The turbulence was light at first, just a soft shudder beneath them that made the water in her glass tremble. Margaret paid it no mind. She had flown often enough to know the difference between weather and something else. But the second jolt came harder, rattling the tray just enough to spill a drop of coffee over the edge of the cup. David's head snapped toward the window, his eyes narrowing. "That felt intentional," he muttered. Margaret set the cup down carefully. "It was." The cabin speaker crackled softly. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We're experiencing a bit of turbulence as we pass over a storm front. Please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts." David's jaw tightened. "A storm front? It's clear outside." Margaret didn't look at him. Her eyes were fixed on the curtain again. "This isn't about the weather," she said quietly. David shook his head, his hand tightening around the armrest. "You'd think by now they'd learn subtlety." Margaret's gaze didn't waver. "They don't need subtlety. They just need enough doubt to make it believable." 10 minutes passed. The plane smoothed once again. But the quiet felt fragile now, as if one wrong move could shatter it. Rachel appeared again, this time with her eyes cast downward. She approached Margaret cautiously, bending slightly to speak just above a whisper. "Miss Daniels," Rachel said, her voice tight, "I think you should know. Captain Brooks has been in the cockpit with the co-pilot since takeoff. I overheard him asking questions about your flight details. I don't think he's just watching, I think he's trying to find something." Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly. "What kind of questions?" Rachel hesitated, glancing over her shoulder toward the galley. "He was asking why you're flying alone," Rachel said. "Wanted to know if anyone had approved your flight directly. It sounded like he was trying to find a reason to make a report." David's hand curled into a loose fist on his knee. Margaret's expression didn't change. She had expected this. "Thank you, Rachel," she said softly. "I appreciate you telling me." Rachel hesitated again, then leaned in closer, her voice dropping lower. "I don't want to overstep," Rachel said carefully, "but I think you should call someone when we land. Just in case." Margaret met Rachel's gaze directly for the first time. There was fear in her eyes. Yes, but there was something else, too. Courage. Margaret's voice softened. "I already have." Rachel nodded, retreating quickly once more. David exhaled slowly. "So what now?" Margaret's eyes returned to the window, watching as the city lights of Chicago began to materialize in the distance. "Now," she said quietly, "we land." David studied her for a long moment. "And after that?" Margaret's reflection in the glass was calm, but her eyes carried the weight of years lived in rooms just like this, rooms where people whispered instead of spoke. And assumptions were built into the very walls. After that, she said, her voice steady, we see who's still standing when the dust settles. The plane dipped slightly, its nose angling downward as the cabin lights brightened in preparation for landing. Chicago's skyline flickered through the window, a jagged line of lights piercing the night. But Margaret Daniels wasn't watching the city. Her eyes rested on the faint reflection of Captain Brooks, visible through the cockpit door's small glass pane. David shifted beside her, fastening his seatbelt with a sharp click. He hasn't let it go, he said, his voice low but sure. Margaret didn't respond immediately. She was listening to the hum beneath the surface, to the unspoken language that filled spaces like this. Men like him never do, she said quietly. Rachel passed through the aisle, her movements brisk, almost too deliberate. Margaret caught her eye just for a second, and in that brief moment, Rachel's gaze spoke volumes, a warning. Margaret's fingers drummed softly against the armrest, but her expression remained composed. She wasn't worried, not in the way David was. Margaret had spent a lifetime walking through rooms where the ground shifted beneath her feet, where the walls pressed in as if to remind her she was never truly welcome. It was the way of things. But that didn't mean she had to accept it. The landing was smooth, the wheels kissing the tarmac with a softness that felt almost ironic. David glanced at Margaret as the plane taxied toward the private hangar. Maybe we should wait for everyone else to disembark, he suggested. Margaret's smile was faint but unyielding. If I wait now, I'll be waiting the rest of my life. David sighed, recognizing the inevitability of her answer. You know Brooks is going to try something. I can feel it. Margaret unfastened her seatbelt. Let him. The plane slowed to a stop, the hum of the engines fading into silence. Rachel appeared once more, opening the door to let the staircase descend. A rush of cold air swept into the cabin. Margaret rose first, retrieving her handbag with a quiet grace that made the space around her feel smaller. David followed closely behind, his gaze scanning the hangar below. Brooks appeared at the cockpit door, his posture stiff, as if the flight had been a test of his patience. Miss Daniels, Brooks called, his voice courteous but cold. I'll need to speak with you before you leave the terminal. There seems to be a discrepancy in your booking details. David's body tensed. Is that so? Margaret placed a hand lightly on David's arm, a silent reminder that this was her battle, not his. She turned to Brooks, her expression unreadable. I wasn't aware there was an issue, she said calmly. Everything seemed fine when I boarded. Brooks stepped forward, holding a clipboard in one hand. It's probably nothing, but I've been instructed to confirm all private charters directly through management. Margaret arched an eyebrow. I see. David stepped closer, his voice tightening. Since when does management second-guess shareholders? Brooks's lips thinned. I'm just following protocol. There it was again, that word, used as a shield, as if invoking it could erase the discomfort of its intent. Margaret met Brooks's gaze, letting the silence stretch just long enough to unnerve him. David, she said quietly, why don't you go ahead? I'll handle this. David hesitated. Margaret. She shook her head, her eyes steady. After a beat, David nodded and descended the steps, his footsteps echoing faintly as he crossed the hangar floor. Margaret faced Brooks fully now, standing so still that the space between them felt charged with something unspoken. You know exactly who I am, she said, her voice low but firm. So let's not pretend this is about protocol. Brooks stiffened, but Margaret saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes. This isn't personal, Miss Daniels, Brooks replied. I'm doing my job. Margaret's gaze sharpened. No, Captain, you're maintaining a pattern, one that's been in place long before either of us boarded this plane. Brooks shifted his weight. I don't make the rules. Margaret stepped forward, closing the distance between them with the quiet confidence of someone who had outlived every attempt to diminish her. No, she said softly. But you enforce them. The words hung between them, heavy with the weight of everything left unsaid. Margaret didn't wait for a response. She descended the steps slowly, her heels clicking softly against the metal, the sound echoing louder than Brooks's presence behind her. At the bottom of the stairs, David was waiting by the car, the engine idling quietly. Margaret climbed into the back seat without a word, and as the door closed behind her, she caught one last glimpse of Brooks standing at the top of the stairs, watching her like a man who had been reminded that the world was changing beneath his feet. David glanced at her through the rearview mirror. You didn't give him much to hold on to, he said with a smirk. Margaret's eyes drifted to the passing lights of the runway. I didn't need to, she replied. Men like him hold on to ghosts. And ghosts disappear in the daylight. David chuckled softly, but Margaret's gaze remained distant, fixed on the city beyond the airport gates. She wasn't thinking about Brooks anymore. She was thinking about the next room, the next battle, and the quiet war that had never truly ended. The car slipped silently through the dark streets of Chicago, the glow of streetlights stretching long shadows across the windshield. Margaret Daniels sat quietly in the backseat, the city blurring past her window in soft smears of gold and steel. David drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting lightly against his chin, but his eyes flickered toward the rearview mirror more than once. He wasn't watching the road, he was watching her. Say it, Margaret said without looking at him. David hesitated, his fingers tapping absently against the steering wheel. I just don't like leaving things unfinished. Margaret's gaze shifted to his reflection. They're never finished. David, you know that. He exhaled softly, as if the weight of her words was something he'd been carrying too. I just keep wondering, he said, his voice low, how long we have to keep doing this. How many more flights? How many more rooms before someone doesn't look at you like you wandered in by mistake? Margaret's eyes drifted to the city lights stretching ahead of them. You're asking the wrong question, she said. David arched a brow, glancing at her. What's the right one, then? Margaret met his eyes through the mirror, her expression calm but unwavering. How long before they realize it doesn't matter how they look at me? David's smirk was faint but real. Maybe longer than either of us would like. Margaret leaned back into the seat, folding her hands lightly in her lap. Then I guess we'll keep flying, she said. The building was quiet when they arrived, a sleek glass tower rising from the heart of the city, its edges softened by the night. David pulled into the underground garage, cutting the engine as the silence of the space wrapped around them. Margaret stepped out first, her heels echoing against the concrete. The elevator at the far end of the garage waited with a soft hum, its doors sliding open as if anticipating their arrival. David followed closely behind, his footsteps heavier than hers. Inside the elevator, David pressed the button for the 28th floor, and as the doors slid shut, the world outside disappeared, leaving only the two of them standing in the quiet hum of the rising box. David watched the numbers climb, his reflection catching the faint flicker of city lights as they passed each floor. You know Brooks isn't going to stop, he said. Margaret's eyes didn't leave the doors. I know. Think he'll try to make noise with the board? Margaret smiled faintly. Let him. David chuckled softly, shaking his head. You enjoy this too much. Margaret turned to him, her gaze sharp but amused. I don't enjoy it, David. I endure it. The elevator chimed, the doors sliding open to reveal the hallway leading to the executive offices. Margaret stepped out first, her stride unhurried but deliberate. David falling in beside her. The receptionist, a young woman with tightly coiled hair, stood as they approached, her eyes bright with recognition. Miss Daniels, she greeted with a polite nod. They're waiting for you in the conference room. Margaret smiled gently. Thank you, Clara. As they moved down the hall, David glanced sideways at her. They really called a meeting this late? Margaret's lips curved slightly. No, but I did. David grinned, shaking his head. Of course you did. The conference room was empty when they entered, but the city stretched wide beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, its pulse alive even at this hour. Margaret crossed the room slowly, her hands tracing the back of one of the leather chairs. David leaned against the doorframe, watching her carefully. What's the play, Margaret? She turned toward him, her silhouette outlined against the glass. There's no play, she said softly, only the truth. David's smile faded slightly. And you think the truth is enough? Margaret's eyes darkened, but her voice remained calm. The truth is all we've ever had. If that's not enough for them, it's not us who need to change. David studied her for a long moment, then nodded quietly. All right, then. The door opened moments later, and Harrison, the CEO, stepped inside, followed by two other board members. Their faces were carefully neutral, but Margaret saw the calculation behind their eyes. Margaret, Harrison greeted, his tone warm but guarded. I wasn't expecting to see you tonight. Margaret offered a faint smile. I thought it was best to get ahead of things. Harrison glanced at David, then back to Margaret. I assume this is about Brooks. Margaret took her seat at the head of the table, folding her hands neatly in front of her. It's about more than Brooks. The two board members exchanged a glance, but Harrison's eyes didn't leave hers. I've been watching the patterns. Margaret continued, her voice steady. Not just his, but others. There's a culture here that needs addressing. One that doesn't reflect the values we claim to stand for. Harrison leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowing. Margaret, I understand your frustration, but it's not frustration, she interrupted gently. It's reality. The room fell silent, the hum of the city below the only sound filling the space. I'm not asking for permission, Margaret said softly. I'm letting you know that the culture changes tonight. Either with you or without you. David's eyes flickered with something like pride. But he said nothing, letting the words settle between them. Harrison exhaled slowly, nodding once. Understood. Margaret rose from her seat, smoothing her blazer as she turned toward the door. Good night, Harrison, she said over her shoulder. I'll expect Brooks's resignation by morning. David followed her out, the door closing quietly behind them. In the elevator, David broke the silence. You think they'll actually fire him? Margaret's smile was faint but sure. They don't have a choice. David chuckled softly. You never needed their permission. Margaret's eyes met his through the mirror as the elevator descended, the city waiting for them below. No, she said quietly. I never did.